The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, now bringing you the second movement of Debussy's La Mer. And right in front of us here is one of the most iconic passages in 20th century orchestral music, which has influenced so many different scores, and especially film scores. You'll notice many film composers having imitated a lot of the features of these mere 2 pages, and in some cases spun them out as long as the director needed the scene to go on. Let's start from the beginning, looking at the orchestra. Now, as I mentioned before, the orchestra is pretty much the same throughout. Debussy uses a very wide color palette for all 3 movements of this work. So there really aren't big changes, but just to notice right at the beginning, there are really no heavy brass except for the trumpets. And the winds are pretty typical. We've got a glockenspiel and a couple of harps on the same staff playing A2. Now, it's interesting that we have a key signature of 4 sharps. Now, these 4 sharps are not actually suggesting that the tonality here is C sharp minor, as you might think from the root of this wind harmony here. Actually, this key signature is F sharp Dorian. So the 6th step of the scale is sharp, right? So you have, instead of a D natural, you have a D sharp on the 6th step. However, that isn't really taken advantage of in the harmony as scored for the rest of the piece. It's just interesting that that is indicated at the beginning when Debussy could have easily just scored this as 3 sharps. So we're starting off with a C sharp 5th in the bassoons, a sounding A third in the clarinets, and then a sounding G sharp in cor anglais. So essentially it's 2 C sharp 5ths stacked on top of each other with an A natural in the middle. So that really does seem like a C sharp minor 6th, but actually here's the root on the 2nd beat, F sharp. And as the music progresses, we see a trading off between the upper strings of these C sharp 5ths. Just little touches of tremolo, getting a little louder each time, and then diminuendoing back to pianissimo. And when you're sitting in front of the orchestra in the stalls, as we call it here in the Commonwealth, in America they call it the orchestra section. In other words, the section of the hall in which the audience sits that is closest to the orchestra. So if you're sitting there, or if you're actually conducting this piece, you can actually feel the sound move across the orchestra in a mysterious way. The little tremolos jumping from group to group of different string players. And that's a very magical effect. And as it reverses, we see this little cascading downward of glockenspiel and then 2 harps, plus a little tish of cymbal. So that is just a wonderful little surge of color, right? And of course, we feel an increase of energy each time and then a decrease. Just a little push of energy and then backwards, of kind of nervous energy because of the tremolo, right? Right into the middle of this, we have these A thirds on our flutes. And you might think, well, they really seem to come from out of nowhere and be almost alien in the relationship that they have to the harmony and everything else that's going on. But actually, that is just the mediant and the dominant of an F sharp minor chord, right? Or F sharp minor scale. So it fits in perfectly, but it just feels so weird because of the emphasis on the C sharp 5th, C sharp and G sharp. G sharp sort of being like the ninth of the F sharp minor chord. Then we have this beautiful downward cascade trading off here with the clarinets. And this is absolutely perfect scoring for winds. So we have the flutes jumping down to a D third. So this is D to F sharp, right? So that's a major third, which is written in the key of A, in a transposing A instrument, as F natural and A, which is also a major third, right? So it's the same exact notes, and the trade-off is absolutely perfect here, going from flute to clarinet, and it should feel completely seamless, almost as if the flutes have turned into clarinets. And I just have to give full credit here to Benjamin Mitchell, who I believe is the manager of Kaleidoscope Chamber Orchestra, for his excellent playing, his excellent leadership of the clarinets right in here. It's just such great playing. And just has a wonderful little arc to it in here, you know, and then this little yeah. And this sort of reminds me of a sort of a deviling of the water, right? The water sort of getting caught up in the motion of the tide and the waves, creating a splash or a scurry as it maybe hits the rocks or as it fights with itself. It's really beautiful, maybe observational scoring, programmatic scoring, but really not tone painting so much, because it's really about Debussy's emotional reaction rather than actually depicting what is going on. This is Debussy's reaction to what he sees rather than about what is happening, right? There's always one step removed in impressionistic composition or scoring. As you may have noticed in a lot of my Orchestration Challenge evaluations, I am trying to warn people off from scoring flute too low. And here, this works fine, because yes, it is low. It's very near the bottom of where a flute can play. But it doesn't really have to compete so much with other instruments, right? All we've got going on alongside those flutes are Debussy cellos, right? So it's not going to be too loud, especially if the cellos don't push too hard. And we got second bassoon under here, a little bit of first bassoon coming in right there, not too loud. And then we've got the first clarinet also doing a bit of a trill right in there. We also don't have to worry about trills out at the very, very end of the flute's foot. Those trills are really impossible if you're trying to trill very quickly between, say, like a B below middle C and then up a half step to C or up a whole step to C sharp, or maybe going from C to D flat, right? Those trills are really hard because the flute player has to almost massage the keys on the flute's foot to just roll their pinky back and forth over the little rollers, which is not very fast. But D natural is actually right in the scale, the normal scale of where the fingers are sitting on the flute. So this is pretty canny scoring. I think Debussy really knew his stuff about the mechanics of wind playing, because his wind scoring is just absolutely perfect all the way through. Now, this ties right over into what's going on here. We've got sul tasto fingered tremolo in our middle strings right in there, second violins and violas, a little bit of pizzicato, kind of just keeping time with the first violins, and a little punctuation at the beginning of the bar by the cellos. And over that, we have this wonderful, almost stifled sounding stuttering from our trumpets. And I like the way that they push into each group. The way that this works really is that the note from the preceding trumpet will be a little bit louder, so it's not going to be a perfect trading off between the two players. The other thing, too, is that there's a real danger that the first player will start a little soft, and then the second player will come in and they will play at the same dynamic as the first player on their first note, and then they will push a little farther, and then the first player will come back in and say, oh, what the hell, and then push a little farther, and by the time you get to here, you're at mezzo forte. That's not what should happen here. It should just be a kind of a snarling little stuttering observation with this wonderful little cushion of muted horn in the background, which will also have a slightly snarly sound. Now, putting that all together, it is, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this talk, an iconic moment, because you have this wonderful scene setting. You have the motion and flow of the harmony across the orchestra, the sparkling sound of the glockenspiel and the harps together, a little tish of the cymbal, the little ambiguous harmony pushing and then receding, pushing and receding, and then the flute coming in above, and this almost whimsical observation that doesn't really seem to have any relationship to what's going on below it, and yet ties the music together so well and leads to this lovely observation of the way that motion and color and emotion work when you are observing how the waves play with one another. And after all, that is the name of this movement, the play of the waves. So, thinking about all of those things, have a listen to this first screen, and then we'll have a longer talk on the next 3 screens. Now we are going to get into some real themes. In this case, it is the cor anglais, da-da-da-dum, and it's interesting that this is stated as all whole steps, right? Remember that we were dealing with whole steps in terms of a whole tone scale in the previous movement. In this case, this is not whole tone harmony by any sense. However, Debussy is still kind of calling back to that, and in playing this, which is, by the way, a C, D, E, F sharp in concert pitch, against a C major 7th chord, he is implying Lydian harmony, right? The raised fourth. So notice how from the previous screen we have changed keys to essentially C major, or lack of key signature. But the raised fourth, in this case, is added on as an accidental. Interesting thing about this, and that is that the raised sixth was in the key signature of the previous screen, but it was actually not really used. Now, there's more going on here than just the raised fourth. We also have, very interestingly, we have a raised sixth. So the entire scale is C, D, E, F sharp, G, so that's the F sharp is the raised Lydian fourth. And then instead of A, we have A sharp, which you can see here in the glockenspiel and in the first violins, and in the harp as well. And then B. So it's a very cool scale. And that's being used throughout here as a kind of a mode, right? So Debussy is trending more to the modal here than he is really dealing with key signatures in and of themselves, or with key-based tonality. So we are going back to tremolo here, very shivering, bustling strings right in here with this rolled pizzicato. By the way, this is one of the easiest rolled pizzicatos to play, right? Because you've got all open strings here. The cellist could actually finger this G above, or they could just reach over the unplayed string of D and then just play everything on open strings. That's what I would do if I were playing this on cello, or the same thing on viola, which I'm much more experienced with. But I mean, I can play cello in a sort of a rudimentary, messing around way. And all of this is intended to be unmeasured tremolo. Notice the 2 beams plus the beam that connects them as eighth notes. That would be considered to be unmeasured tremolo, triple beam tremolo. Okay, so let's look at the way the passage is constructed. The harp's rolling up here with just a touch of trumpet sounding middle C, and that's the exact same note. These G's an octave apart, right? Remember, up a fourth, down a fifth. So it's going to be the same middle C, ba-da-da-dum, ending up on the F sharp. And that in itself, even though it makes perfect sense diatonically, right, in the mode of this passage, it still feels weird, right? Because we are used to going 4 steps in a row as approaching a leading tone, right? So we would end up on the leading tone here, and then we would resolve to the next note, which would be the tonic of the scale. So that's where we run into 3 whole steps in a row. However, starting on the perceived tonic is strange because you end up kind of sitting on that raised fourth. And with this beautiful little gleaming right in here of the glockenspiel over similar chords to what we heard before. Remember when the trumpets were kind of going, blah, 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 kind of doing their blah, 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 kind of a thing. We had a similar thing happening in the horns. And it just has a little bit of color underneath the glockenspiel and provides a little bit more context to the harmony of what is happening in the strings. Now, of course, this is really just, concert G, concert middle C, and then concert E. So it fits right into the whole idea of C major 7th, the 7th being supplied by the B right here in the first violins. And then the tonic here kind of gleaming above on the glockenspiel. Just really, really enchanting. And the same thing again. The tenuto on the strings is just a way of making things firmer, right? And then continuing on, it lets off. So it is almost like saying forte piano, right? It's almost like giving a forte piano accent to the downbeat there. But this is just a great way of solving that problem without having any kind of fancy stuff and, having like mezzo forte piano or something like that, or mezzo piano pianissimo. That stuff gets to be ridiculous after a while. This is just a very easy way of solving that problem, emphasizing this harmony as it comes in and then letting off as we go forward. So the same thing happens twice, and then the English horn starts to develop the melody a little bit, and then as it arcs downward in pitch, da 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 da, and it's really syncopating 2s against 3s, isn't it? Like 3 groups of 2 against 2 measures of 3. Then this note right in here is just C below middle C, being held by the 4th horn. And that's a perfectly secure note. People are a little worried about the remonstrations that they read in orchestration manuals about how the horns, when they're playing low notes, should always be paired together in unison, but this certainly is not low enough for that to be a concern. Now, if it were, say, maybe written C below middle C or lower, then I would say, yeah, watch out. But this is a perfectly firm, beautiful note. It's still going to be pianissimo from our context from before, and then everybody else playing very softly. And this is just gradually adding motion. Notice that it's also working 2 against 3, along with this da 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 da. And of course, the conductor is still going to be conducting in 3. So down da 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 down da 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 da. And then things just get more intense right in here, adding on the flute above, which is playing in triplets, but essentially the same thing that is going on in the English horn an octave lower, right? Not down a fourth, but down an octave because of the transposition. And here's where that A sharp really comes to play, doesn't it? We're hearing the A sharp going back and forth in the harp. This is all perfectly audible because of the very soft texture. And then here is where the harp starts to kind of disappear a little bit as the first violins get louder and louder and louder. By the time you get to the end of the bar, the harp will be just really hard to hear. And I would actually feel as a conductor it would be okay for the harpist to increase here to mezzo forte. In fact, they will probably be playing mezzo forte from the beginning and then just increase to forte if you really want to hear them as this passage opens out. Because everybody else is going pianissimo crescendo to the next dynamic, right? And that next dynamic is actually subito pianissimo. So you have to think that the push is going to be to mezzo forte probably, and then just suddenly drop off to pianissimo, accent, tenuto. And this is very much the same as like writing a mezzo piano stress on a downbeat, or a mezzo forte piano accent. Notice the bracket here. This is basically just telling us that this is Debussy in two parts. So one half of the desk is going to be playing this high E sharp, and then the other players are going to play this F sharp major third as a double stop, which is totally easy. Speaking of sharps, notice how the tonality has changed to all sharps, 7 sharps. So you would think that would be the key of C sharp major, and in this case, you would actually be right. And the reason for that is that this is a G sharp ninth chord, right? Implying being played on the dominant, right? And then here we have ba-da-da-dum. So F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B sharp. And that is leading to the tonic, right? If we were going to just keep right on going. So F sharp being the subdominant, this is actually in the position where we would be used to hearing 3 whole steps in a row in a piece that was more a part of common practice harmony. And the F sharp is certainly not the same thing as the root of the chord. As in the previous chord, remember it was a C sharp major 7th chord with a sort of a raised A sharp from time to time. And the theme started on the tonic, the perceived tonic of C. So this time we have a chord of a G sharp 13th with the theme starting in oboe on the F sharp. So I'm going over some of the harmony with this. I'm sort of doing smaller sections of this, and I'm talking about the harmony just in ways so that you can understand that this is a part of contrasting orchestral color, right? It's not so much for its own sake. I don't want these to be harmony lessons at all because, even though I would like to think that I have a firm grasp of harmony for my own uses as a composer, it's really not what I teach. It's kind of like asking, say, a chef who specializes in Mexican food to cook you some Asian food or something like that, right? It's just me out of my element going over all the different things because I don't think from the bottom up with harmony. I sort of just think about what's going on in harmony in the moment, right? And I think a good, grounded, more organized harmony teacher would be teaching things from the ground up more. But to get back to orchestration, let's just look at the way this is all written out. So we've got this beautiful G sharp 13 chord. The 13 is basically this E sharp tremolo in the second violins. And that note is being doubled by the first horn. And then our third and fourth horns are doubling the thirds in the violas. And then an octave above, we have exactly the same 3 notes in our first violins. And they don't need to be doubled by anything in the winds because the body of tone of the horns is actually filling in what's going on with the strings. And then, of course, the strings themselves are sounding their body of tone an octave above the fundamental tones here. So we've got that ba-da-da-dum, and then we have this beautiful billowing arpeggio from the harps, which are completed by the glockenspiel. Such a lovely idea. So you don't have to send the harpist all the way up to the top there. Just use the glockenspiel to complete the arpeggio, and it's just as effective. And you get that beautiful glittering sound, which kicks off the next ya-da-da-dum by the oboe. And then da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and so on. Now, the same exact thing happens as before with the English horn. The theme sort of climbs downwards. And what's interesting here is the trade-off Here, I think the copyist has made a little bit of an error in adding this rest below. I believe this is always played as A2 right in here with two oboes basically playing that same theme. So this would imply a third oboist, but there was no change indicated in the score for the English horn player to change over to third oboe. So it's just a little bit of a mistake there in the engraving. Now, while the oboes are playing out the theme right in there, they're getting a little bit of accompaniment from above, from the glockenspiel, and I really love the motion right in here from the strings, basically slowly kind of sagging downwards, bit by bit, and then climbing up a little bit again to E sharp and then sagging downward again, with the first bassoon in the middle of the sound picture, kind of tracking the motion of the oboes from below at an octave, and this lovely syncopated harp playing on every third, eighth note. It's just a really delightful passage. Now, this is all leading to another key change. So let's recall where we were before. We had a G sharp 13 chord, right? And then the theme and the harmony progressed a little bit. Then here on this screen, we have the music kind of freeing itself up a little bit, and the English horn playing the same exact three notes that were played by the oboe on the previous screen. You know, da-da-da-dum, but in this case not expressed as F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B sharp, right? But expressed as G flat, sounding G flat, same as F sharp, and basically and harmonically the same thing down an octave. And very powerful scoring right in here. The English horn is in a really strong place right in here, and it works beautifully with the horns. And just a touch right in here of harp, which sort of works. And then this wonderful cascade down, this reaction. And what is actually going on here harmonically is that those same four notes of the previous page, which played over a G sharp 13 chord, are now put in a different context by a B flat complete dominant ninth chord, right? So this note right here, which ends on C, is essentially the top note of the ninth, right? So it's that particular context. The first notes are not really playing in the context of the chord, but they end up in the destination of being the ninth of this chord that you can read here in the harps, and which is also being played by the horns and English horn in the same exact voicing on the same pitches. So just really lovely setup and lovely change of context harmonically. And once again, we're just really throwing the common practice harmony workbook out the window and just focusing on what makes the instruments sound good and what fulfills the imagination of the composer. To get back to this cascading, notice the difference in motion, right? We have the flutes and piccolo and clarinets basically playing in a downward arpeggiated motion over those same three notes of the top of the chord, right? And then we have the oboes basically just walking down chromatically from D, which would be the mediant of the chord, right? The middle note of our first triad, walking down 6 steps till it gets down to here to become the dominant of a D minor chord, which is where the harmony ends. And then the F trumpets basically just rip up along to the pizzicato. It's such a wonderful symphonic gesture right in here, isn't it? It's symphonic scoring as opposed to, say, theatrical or programmatic scoring. It really has the groups of instruments working together in integrated ways. And in these lectures so far, I've really focused on programmatic music. Our first lecture dealt with The Rite of Spring, a ballet, and then we went to the planets, which was essentially a mood piece, which was highly cinematic in a very prophetic way. And then we shifted from there to Pictures at an Exhibition, orchestrated by Ravel, original score by Mussorgsky. And that was music that was very, very programmatic. In essence, each movement like a mini tone poem. And from there, I went completely abstract to Schoenberg. And yet, none of those scores really had that symphonic kind of organization of the orchestration and the different functions in the score. So here we're getting to really more of a symphonic kind of organization. And I think I'm going to go in a bit of a symphonic direction with the next couple of lectures, not to give away what I'm going to be studying with you guys next, but just to give you a little bit of a heads up. I really love the glockenspiel coming over the top and the touch of triangle right there at the end. So cymbal, glockenspiel, ending with triangle. And the triangle starts off the trumpets doing their little da-da-dum with mutes, which has that wonderful feeling. They feel so distant, don't they? And yet very present. Then the passage finishes off with these lovely trills in the cellos, with a little bit of harp doubling. And if this is done correctly, it almost feels like pizzicato doubling in the harps. I'll end this lecture here because I feel that I want to cover these pieces with more short lectures rather than fewer longer lectures. I just feel that it's easier for people to absorb the information and to be able to feel like they can watch the same video a couple of times without getting a huge jolt of information that's like an hour or an hour and a half long. I'd like to keep things maybe around half an hour to 45 minutes of lecturing along with each bit of music that I talk about. So in our next lecture, we are going to go on to the next screen in which we have the next major theme for this movement, which is extremely intense, poetic, and yearning. For now, though, listen for all of those things, the beautiful symphonic construction of this page with the horns almost barking out the accompaniment underneath the English horn with a little reaction from the flutes. And speaking of barking, the final wrapping up by trumpet and pizzicato, which repeats twice, slightly different harmonic context at the end for the trumpets, but not a big deal. Then listen for the two different statements of this first theme. Whether it's on this second page, over a G-sharp 13 chord, with the accompaniment of horns and billowing harps and glockenspiel and tremolo strings, with the way that things intensify towards the end, or whether it's this first statement with a much sparser kind of accompaniment, just a little bit of billowing harp, just a little bit of tremolo strings in the background, and just a touch of horn from here to there. And I will see you in a day or two for the second part of my lectures on this second movement of La Mer.